He divorced her to protect her because distance meant protection. Now she is starving on the streets and pregnant with his child. Mafia boss Dante Morty thought everything had been handled with settlements. But when a call reveals she is unconscious in an unsafe neighborhood, a dark truth drops. His own men were ordered to cut her off. They wanted his pregnant ex-wife exposed as a threat before the child even existed. And Dante is about to make them a horrific example.
Let us look closely at Dante Morty. You and I have seen men like him, but rarely this fractured. Picture his boardroom, a physical reflection of a guarded soul. Sounds while swallowing walls isolate him from reality. Cold lighting casts severe shadows across his unreadable face. Outside, the city screams, but in here it is a sterile vacuum ruled by ego. He sits at the head of the table, weaponizing silence. He never shouts. He lets ambient dread crush the room. A captain stammers through reports, while Dante slowly traces his whiskey glass with deadened eyes. There is a terrifying emptiness radiating from him. It reveals a simple, undeniable truth. Building impenetrable walls to keep out the pain of the world only ever traps us inside with our own ghosts. Examine the hollow core of this man. 3 months ago, Dante ended his marriage to Elena with the same dead-eyed indifference he applies to his underworld logistics. One swift signature severed her from his life like a surgical cut. He convinced himself it was merely a business move, masking a profound terror of human connection behind toxic stoicism. But fate always demands its toll. As the sweating captain drones on, the absolute silence of Dante's fortress is violently breached. A harsh vibration from his phone cuts the heavy air. Around the table, every hardened man freezes. Notice the bitter irony playing out here. You can spend a lifetime building a flawless illusion of absolute control, only for a single mechanical sound to rip the foundation right out from under you. Only Marco is allowed to pierce the room's blackout. Notice Dante's deliberate body language here. He does not reach for the phone. Instead, he lets it vibrate, keeping a predatory stare locked firmly on the sweating captain. He forces the man to crumble under the psychological weight of the interruption. Once the subordinate stammers to a halt, Dante picks up the device with the terrifying precision of someone who believes he owns time itself. He speaks one flat word, yes, but on the other end, Marco hesitates. It is a thick, agonizing pause. We often learn the hard way that the moment before our lives completely shatter is rarely marked by a massive explosion. The greatest personal tragedies usually begin with nothing more than a breathless, entirely unexpected hesitation. You and I know that even the hardest masks hide fragile fractures. Marco's silence is the hammer striking Dante's weak point. When he speaks, his voice is rough, causing an involuntary spasm in the boss's knuckles. We found her. Those 3 words bypass every iron wall Dante built, violently ripping open the repression buried beneath the divorce papers. Watch his eyes. The awareness drains out, detaching completely from the room. Your ex-wife. She is pregnant. 4 months. At those words, Dante's physical body freezes. His untouchable syndicate evaporates. He stops breathing. 4 months. The math crashes over him like a tidal wave. It is a harsh awakening, proving that no amount of ruthless power can ever shield a person from the irreversible consequences of their past choices. That timeline violently strips away his delusion of control. It drags him back to that one night of raw vulnerability, the night he fiercely punished himself for, treating love like a fatal disease. He fled before sunrise, using divorce papers as a tourniquet to stop his bleeding heart. Then Marco delivers the final blow. She is unconscious. Here is a simple truth we all must eventually face. You can never outrun your own humanity, no matter how deeply you bury it. Watch the frame carefully. See the exact moment Dante's internal architecture shatters. To the terrified men at the table, he merely stands up. But that sharp scrape of his chair against the floor is the deafening sound of a hollow king entirely losing his grip on the universe he sacrificed his soul to build. The paralysis inside the boardroom is absolute. Dante whispers a hoarse demand for the location, the address mapping to a dangerous slum in his mind. The dark reality completely short-circuits his brain. He had wired her millions, foolishly believing that wealth could wash away the tragedy of their ruined love. His fragile ego that never calculated the agonizing emotional withdrawal Elena would endure. Like a wounded bird thrown out of a gilded cage, she spiraled into the gutters, subconsciously seeking the chaotic familiarity of fear. Why is she alone? Why is she hurt? His godlike self-image violently fractures. We often forget that money can buy silence, but it can never buy absolution. Boss, Marco pleads over the phone, his dead voice spiking with a rare panic. We need to move right now. Dante kills the call. Watch him closely here, as you and I unpack this heartbreaking shift together. He reaches for his tailored coat with mechanical grace, but look at his hands. They are trembling. His jaw is locked so tight it might shatter. The godlike mask is dissolving into dust. Meeting is over, he growls. There is no brilliant strategy anymore, no calm delegation. In a single instant, the cold kingpin devolves into a desperate, terrified father. When a foolish captain dares to ask about the docks, Dante's quiet command to handle it is not a normal business order. It is a lethal promise of violence. He storms out, radiating a frantic heat. It proves that true love, when buried alive for too long, will always violently tear its way back to the surface. Follow the camera tracking Dante down the shadowed corridor. Armed guards stiffen as he passes, sensing the dark storm. He projects control, but step inside the descending elevator with him. Watch his rigid posture finally break. He leans against the cold mirrored wall, haunted by the ghost of Elena from 4 months ago. She stood at the door with one small suitcase, turning back, silently praying he would beg her to stay. He merely watched her leave. He disguised his emotional cowardice as harsh logic, telling himself love was a dangerous weakness. The tragedy of the human heart is that we constantly tell ourselves noble lies to avoid facing our deepest fears. Stepping out into the freezing city air, the massive empire he built means absolutely nothing to a man losing his mind. The external world still bows to his wealth. Marco has the black sedan idling at the curb. Dante slides into the leather seats, the armored door sealing shut with the finality of a vault. The engine roars, tires screaming against the asphalt, yet Dante registers none of it. His dark eyes stare blankly through the tinted glass, completely blind to the passing streetlights. All he sees is Elena, lying cold and broken on dirty concrete, holding the fragile life of his unborn child. For a man who plays God, there is genuinely no hell worse than total powerlessness. A paralyzing fear finally sinks its claws deep into his chest. But the cruelest twist of this tragedy is that miles away, Elena had already been living in that exact same terrifying nightmare for months. Let us shift our lens to Elena, capturing the brutal reality of her collapse. Her bare knees violently slam against the frozen concrete, sending a sharp jolt of pain up her spine. Notice the sheer apathy of the city. Blinding headlights cut through the fog, and faceless pedestrians step over her as if she were just a fallen shadow. This profound isolation is the heaviest burden of all. Yet, even as her vision fades to black, a fierce maternal instinct overrides her failing body. She curls inward, pressing a trembling, dirt-stained hand over her stomach. She is desperate to shield the only pure thing left in her ruined world. She never wanted to fall this far. It reminds us of a bitter truth. Life rarely ever asks for our permission before it completely, devastatingly falls to pieces. Lying on the freezing pavement, fragments of her past flash through her mind like broken glass. She remembers the sprawling penthouse, the icy perfection of marble floors, the suffocating quiet of infinite wealth, the rich spice of Dante's cologne. She allowed herself to believe that Golden Cage was a forever home. Her trust was a beautiful, fatal mistake. When the end came, it was not a tearful goodbye. It was a cold execution. The divorce severed her life like a steel guillotine, silent, swift, and absolute. Lawyers handed her the papers without a single word of explanation. She was erased from his kingdom before sunset. There is a deeply painful lesson woven into her scars. Placing your entire sense of security into the hands of another human being is the most dangerous gamble a person can make. You and I have witnessed this tragic downfall too many times. Picture her standing in the rain, clutching that thick manila envelope. Her identity was erased with the stroke of a pen. She dialed his private number until her fingers bled, begging for a lifeline. Every call was met with a cold silence, blocked by men paid to forget her name. She thought he was just angry. She naively thought the monster she loved would soften. By the time the suffocating reality of her exile took root, it was entirely too late. The meager payout vanished instantly. Rent and medical bills devoured her savings, leaving her starving in the bitter cold. It is terrifying how quickly a life of velvet and silk can dissolve into a bloody, desperate fight just to survive the night. Let's take a closer look together at how the human spirit fights tooth and nail to survive. Elena began pawning the heavy, gilded chains of her past. First, the diamond necklaces, then the silk designer dresses. Every trip to the pawn shop was a painful stripping away of the false identity Dante had forced onto her. But the real tragedy wasn't the loss of wealth. It was the absolute shattering of her safety. That illusion cracked the second she realized she was totally alone on these cold streets, carrying a child she fiercely refused to regret. Her dizzy spells had started weeks ago, brushed off as mere exhaustion. Here is a simple truth we all face. Our minds can easily ignore the loudest physical alarms when we are desperately focused on just making it to tomorrow. The camera pulls back to reveal the grim, exhausting reality of her daily life. Working bone-crushing shifts at a rundown local diner, her body finally gave out. The manager saw only a liability, a weak link, and mercilessly slashed her hours. Her meager income evaporated overnight. Suddenly, a basic meal became a rare luxury, strictly rationed. She starved herself, ignoring her own basic needs just to keep the fragile life inside her growing. It is a heartbreaking twist on the ironclad safety Dante once promised. When powerful men treat human beings like disposable chess pieces, it is always the innocent who suffer the most. It leaves us with a quiet, devastating truth. True strength isn't measured by how ruthlessly you can control people, but by how deeply you care for them. You and I know exactly what happens when the human body runs entirely on empty. The brain simply starts to shut down. Let the lens focus on Elena, pushed to the absolute edge of physical collapse. She had eaten nothing but a discarded half sandwich in over 24 hours. The dark, cracked street began to spin wildly around her. The glowing yellow street lamps smeared into long, distorted streaks of light. Watch her hand tremble as she reaches for the cold metal of a park bench, her fingers slipping helplessly as her last ounce of strength vanishes. She hits the concrete hard, but the impact feels miles away, a merciful detachment from the brutal pain. Sometimes, when life strips away everything we have, our lowest moments force us to find a strange, quiet peace in the silence. Every single breath became a desperate, burning fight for air, and right here at the absolute breaking point, her mind did something tragic. It retreated to the very man who broke her. She didn't see the cold, calculating monster who had abandoned her. Instead, she clung to the warm, perfect ghost of the man from their early dates. It is a devastating reality of trauma. Sometimes, we hold on to the twisted shadow of our captor just to feel a fleeting sense of safety. His name slipped through her chapped lips. Dante. It was barely a whisper, heavy with an ocean of unspoken grief. Her cold fingers instinctively curled tightly over her stomach. "I am trying," she spurred into the night. This reveals a quiet truth. Even in our darkest hours, the instinct to protect keeps us fighting. "I am really trying," she breathed, her voice cracking as her body finally surrendered to the crushing exhaustion she had fought off for weeks. The winter chill pierced through her thin coat, swallowing her still form as the world went entirely black. But right before the darkness took her, a tiny, fragile flutter against her palm pulled her back. A heartbeat. She was not alone. Now, watch the shadows shift as the predator enters the frame. A heavy black sedan turned onto the dead street, moving with a fast, calculated aggression. Its bright headlights sliced right through the gloom, exposing the cracked pavement. The car didn't slow down. It tore through the neighborhood, radiating complete dominance. Life teaches us that the past never truly stays buried. It always races back to find us. Inside the suffocating silence of the car, Dante sat completely motionless. He didn't need to speak to rule the space. The sheer, oppressive weight of his presence wrapped around his men like a tightened noose. Marco, sitting in the front seat, gripped the wheel with a rigid jaw, his eyes frantically scanning the darkness. Up ahead, Marco finally muttered, pointing to the left side near a broken bus stop. He kept his voice flat and careful, terrified that a single loud word might ignite his boss's explosive temper. The heavy car glided to a smooth stop, but Dante was already moving. He threw the door open with a violent force that shattered the dead quiet of the street. It is a harsh lesson in pride. The walls we build to project power often trap us in our own desperate panic. The biting wind hit him instantly, but he didn't feel the cold. His dark eyes locked onto the small broken figure on the pavement, his vision tunneling until nothing else existed. You and I need to pause and look at the sheer denial playing out in his mind right here. For a split second, his arrogant, controlling brain flat out rejected what he was seeing. He tried to tell himself she was fine, perfectly safe, under the massive surveillance web he controlled. But that fragile lie crumbled the second his expensive leather shoes hit the pavement beside her. "Elena," he whispered. The word fell out of him, completely stripping away his untouchable mask. We often blind ourselves with the illusion of control, only realizing the truth when our mistakes are lying broken right at our feet. She was curled tightly on her side, her trembling hand locked fiercely over her stomach. Even as her body shut down, the fierce, beautiful instinct of a mother fighting to protect her child kept her grounded. Dante slammed onto his knees, dragging his expensive coat through the filthy street. For a man obsessed with perfect control and image, this sudden, careless desperation reveals everything. The only things that mattered were the terrifying shallowness of her breath and the ghostly white color of her face. "Cristo," he breathed out. It was a raw, unfiltered sound of pure terror. His shaking fingers reached out, brushing against her hollow cheek. Life violently humbles us, proving all the status in the world means nothing when the people we love are slipping away. This wasn't just the cold weather taking hold of her. This was the brutal, physical cost of his neglect, the tragic decay of someone deprived of basic human survival. Acting purely on instinct, Dante's shaking hands gently brushed the dirty hair from her face, exposing the sharp, hollowed-out bones of her cheeks. This starved, broken reality violently destroyed the perfect, untouched memory of her he had kept in his head. "Boss," Marco called out softly from the shadows. "We have to go. She has been out here way too long." Dante didn't even hear him. His dark gaze dropped lower, locking onto the soft, undeniable curve hidden beneath her worn-out sweater. It shows us that avoiding responsibility never protects anyone. It only creates deeper wounds we eventually have to face head-on. In that single heartbeat, his entire universe shifted on its axis. 4 months. It was no longer just an abstract number floating in his head. It was a living, breathing reality pressing right against his palm. She was carrying his child out here in the freezing dark, entirely outside of his suffocating control. For a man who needs to play God with everyone's life, there is no greater terror than realizing he is utterly powerless. The muscles in his jaw locked tight as a dark, violent rage began to boil up inside him. "How long?" he demanded. The deep, lethal drop in his voice forced the men behind him to freeze. How long has she been lying here like this? It is a stark lesson that true power isn't about controlling others, but having the humility to care for them before it is too late. "We got the call from one of the street watchers 10 minutes ago," Marco stammered out. He said she just collapsed. Out of nowhere, there was a slight hesitation before he made the call. At that word, Dante went totally rigid. He slowly stood up, turning his head to lock onto Marco with the cold, dead eyes of a predator about to strike. Hesitation. In Dante's world, a delayed phone call was an unforgivable sin, a mistake paid for with blood. Marco took a slow, shaky breath. "You told them to just watch her." The orders were strict. Do not step in unless someone attacks her. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the frozen street. Our own rigid rules often blind us to the actual harm we cause. Dante locked her out to keep her safe, but his blind arrogance had nearly killed her. Seeing her lying, broken on the pavement, finally shattered his massive ego. His distance hadn't acted as a shield. His physical absence had built the very trap that was starving her to death. He squeezed her freezing fingers, desperately trying to anchor himself to the ground, as his illusion of being a perfect protector fell to pieces. "Get the car running right now," he ordered, his voice cold and leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We are not taking her to a public hospital." Marco gave a quick, tense nod. "Already done. A private clinic, 0 paper trail, and no questions asked." Dante slid his heavy arms gently under her back, lifting her off the ice. It is a sobering truth. Our pride is completely useless when we are left holding the fragile pieces of a life we broke ourselves. Let us look closely at this opening shot in the garage. The ugly lighting beats down on Dante as he holds Elena. You can almost feel the cold weight of her fading heartbeat pressing into his chest. He pins her limp body against his collarbone, and if you watch his hands that usually deal in pure violence, they are shaking. The only proof she is still breathing is a faint brush of air on his neck. "Stay with me," he whispers. "You do not get to disappear like this." He walks her to the car with stiff, robotic steps, but inside, the man is breaking into pieces. It reminds us of a hard truth. The walls we build to keep out the pain usually end up trapping us inside it. The heavy car door slams hard, locking them in the dark, where he cradles her against the freezing night. The heavy silence inside the speeding car makes the wild hammering of his heart sound deafening. His shaking hand drifts down to rest over her stomach, searching for the unborn life he failed to guard. "Drive, Eve," he barks. The tires scream as the car launches forward. Passing streetlights flash across his tense face, highlighting the obsessive way he stares at Elena. He studies her hollowed cheeks, counting every drop of life that has drained away. His thumb finds her thin wrist, feeling for a weak pulse. For anyone else, that beat would mean hope, but twisted love is a dangerous thing. When you treat affection like ownership, you only end up destroying what you hold. A dark sickness takes root in Dante right now. It is not mercy or relief, but a blinding, cold hunger for revenge. What wakes up inside him in this moment is much darker than normal human grief. The camera drifts to his face, showing the cold math running behind his eyes. Every passing second makes the truth heavier. Someone else let this happen. Someone let his ultimate prize rot away to the edge of death, while he was looking the other way. This brings us to a hard lesson we all have to face eventually. Real love means giving up your need to control. Forcing someone into a cage will always break their spirit, no matter how much you claim to care. Dante cannot see this at all. He turns his icy stare to the black window, and his reflection stares back like a mask of pure hate. "Marco," he says softly, his voice totally empty of human feeling. "Find out exactly who was on watch tonight. You and I are going to unpack this scene together, because it perfectly captures a broken man backed into a corner. Watch how the lens frames his reaction to the truth." His hand clamps down harder on Alina, not out of gentle care, but raw ownership. In this shot, she is just an item that belongs to him. "Do not bring me excuses," he tells his driver, his voice dropping into the dead, flat tone of a hunting animal. The car tears through the dark city toward a secret underground clinic, a perfect visual for his need to bury his life away from normal society. It is funny how an obsession with power always leaves a person completely powerless in the end. For Dante, this mistake by his guards is a massive betrayal, and for a man built on dominance, betrayal means a total bloody war. The film cuts to the inside of the clinic. It is a quiet, spotless space that mirrors the layout of his own troubled mind. Bright light hits the cold steel, built for total control and hiding away from the sun. Heavy doors slide open, feeding Dante's sick belief that he commands life and death. Walking down the bare hallway, he ignores the building entirely. The camera locks onto his chest, where he grips Alina like she is his own missing lung. Nurses run into the frame. Dante shouts for her numbers, his voice cracking like a whip. The head doctor begs for her to be put on a bed, but Dante will not let go. Real safety comes from trust, not brute force. Yet he holds onto her tightly, trying to squeeze survival into her body by sheer force of his own stubborn will. Notice the painful stretched out pause in this shot. Dante locks his dead eyes onto the head doctor, silently deciding if this man is allowed to touch his property. The doctor mentions severe starvation, keeping his voice low and soft to avoid sparking a violent outburst. Very slowly, Dante lowers her down onto the bright white sheets. The camera catches the sad, heavy way he moves. His shaking fingers drag across her pale skin for just a second too long. Letting go of the people we care about, even when it is to save them, is often the hardest thing we ever do. For Dante, giving up control feels like tearing off his own skin. He steps right behind the rolling bed as it moves down the hall. The nurses instinctively shrink away from him, parting like grass before a heavy storm. The steady beep of hospital machines takes over the sound design, creating a fragile rhythm of a life barely holding on. Wires snake across her skin, measuring the terrible physical damage that his fear created. Dante stands stiff at the end of the bed, washed in the cold blue light of the screens. He stares at the dropping numbers, not with sadness, but like a boss reviewing stolen money. Her pulse is weak. Then, the doctor quietly speaks up. She is 4 months pregnant. Dante goes entirely rigid. For a broken man like this, a baby is not a gift. It is a piece of his own dark empire passing to the next generation. The need to leave a mark on the world will ruin us if we forget to care for the people standing right beside us. He pushes down his grief, leaving only cold anger. Behind those dead eyes, you can almost see Dante putting the ugly timeline together. The missed calls, the quiet days, the secret ways she tried to run away from him. The doctor stammers as he orders emergency scans, warning that her broken body might simply give out. The camera pushes in on Dante very slowly. He steps closer to the bed, staring down at Alina's bruised face with a scary, focused intensity. "You save both," he whispers. It sounds like a prayer, but the sharp edge in his voice makes it a deadly promise. He strips away all medical logic, replacing it with his own dark rule. Trying to force life to bend to your will only blinds you to the harm you cause. The room breaks into a fast, nervous panic as nurses rush around, terrified of the violent man standing in the dark. Pay attention to how the director frames his body here. Dante ignores the waiting chair. He stands perfectly still, looking like a statue carved out of pure anger. His mind only knows how to process pain by turning it into a question of power, completely skipping over basic human pity. True healing always asks us to be vulnerable, but Dante sees any open wound as a weakness that will get him killed. Marco steps into the harsh light, his feet heavy, whispering that the doors are locked down. Dante lets a horrible silence hang in the air, a classic bully tactic. Before finally turning his head, he asks about the guard. Marco flinches just for a second and stammers that they have the man tied up. Dante says softly that he will do the questioning. His tight jaw promises a bloodbath. That tiny twitch in his jaw is the only warning we get. He quietly tells Marco that he should already know if the captive is lying to save his own skin. Marco looks at the floor, sweating, and points out a small hole in the guard's story. In Dante's lockdown world, even a tiny white lie is an act of total war. It is funny how demanding absolute perfection from everyone around you guarantees that you will die completely alone. He turns his sad, heavy eyes back to Alina, tracking the wild green lines on the screen. Marco nervously explains that the guard thought he was following orders, watching her fade away because no one broke in from the outside. Dante's expression goes completely dark. To the guard, her slow death was fine. Dante reaches down and lightly touches her freezing arm. Under his fingers, her heartbeat feels like a dying bird. Dante tells the empty room that he never gave those orders. His voice drops into a flat, dead register, losing all its panic and settling into a cold, hunting focus. Listen closely to what he says next. "I do not leave what belongs to me unprotected. It is the ultimate sign of a poisoned mind." He sees her as a stolen painting, not a flesh and blood woman. Holding onto love too tightly turns the house into a prison for everyone inside. Marco stays frozen, totally beaten down by this scary reality. The lead doctor steps back into the shot, wiping sweat off his face, and quietly says they have stopped her organs from failing for now. He stops talking, too scared to mention the real danger. Dante slowly asks about the child. The doctor stumbles over his words, confirming a tiny heartbeat. He carefully warns that both the mother and the baby are balancing on a knife edge. But a man like Dante simply refuses to believe in weakness. He steps up to the mattress, his shaking hand floating just above her pale cheek, never actually touching the skin. "Fix it," he says softly, his words dropping like an executioner's axe. The doctor promises to do his very best. This makes Dante's deep mental sickness flare up into the open. He stares right through the doctor, sucking all the warmth out of the room. "That is not what I said," he hisses. Real strength is learning to accept the things we cannot change, but Dante expects the whole world to obey his grief. The doctor nods, terrified by the monster standing in front of him. Let us pause right here, you and I, to witness how a fractured mind digests absolute failure. The camera tracks Dante's hollow gaze as he reviews his rigid security empire. He knows this tragedy was no simple mistake. It was a calculated strike. As the silence deepens, his paranoia hardens into cold stone. Someone intentionally allowed his empire to burn. Look at the framing of his hands. His knuckles turn bone white as they curl around the steel bedrail. A lesser man might shatter the glass and scream until his lungs gave out, but burying raw pain only breeds a more terrifying monster. Dante bypasses the chaotic grief entirely, slipping into the dark depths of hyper-focused revenge. It teaches us a grim truth. When we refuse to feel our sorrow, it metastasizes into a wrath that consumes everyone in its path. The camera pushes in on Dante, revealing a man whose fury has hardened into cold permanence. His dark eyes remain locked on Elena as he quietly orders Marco to hunt down the rat who altered his strict directives. His voice drops to a chilling whisper, demanding Marco delay the execution. Marco assumes this pause is mere syndicate protocol, but watch Dante carefully. He lets his hand lower, his knuckles gently brushing against Elena's pale fingers. He needs a physical anchor to ground his fractured ego, wanting to map every vein of this betrayal before he cuts it out. The detached rhythm of the heart monitor keeps perfect time. We eventually learn that the deepest betrayals often reveal what we truly value, right before we are forced to burn the world down to keep it safe. Dante remains frozen beside the bed, a statue sculpted by his own obsession, refusing to let us slip away a second time. A silent war rages behind his eyes. Now the camera shifts, and you and I are pulled directly into Elena's waking mind. For survivors of trauma, consciousness never returns softly. It shatters into sharp, jagged fragments. The mechanical beeping registers first, crashing violently into her senses. Then comes the physical reality. The freezing pavement is replaced by the suffocating weight of hospital linens. The air reeks of sterile antiseptic, yet it carries a darker, familiar scent her mind desperately struggles to place. It shows us how we instinctively block out the things that hurt us most, building walls when the heart is simply too broken to endure reality. Elena tries to move, but her limbs feel like poured concrete. Her body is completely unresponsive, a physical symptom of a soul pushed past its breaking point. A raw groan tears from her throat, and the heart monitor spikes, screaming her wakefulness into the room. Heavy, deliberate footsteps cross the floor. Easy. That single spoken word slices cleanly through her mental fog. It is Dante. Notice the terror bleeding into her body language. Her breath catches violently before her eyes even flutter open. She detaches, begging the universe that his voice is just a cruel hallucination. It highlights the tragedy of a captive heart. We often cling to the familiar source of our darkest terror as a false comfort, simply because we have nothing else left to hold on to in the cold dark. Elena's eyes finally open, but the crushing gravity in the room does not vanish. The harsh fluorescent light paints the cold lines of the space. And then she sees him. Dante stands, looming over the bed, his jaw pulled tight, his dark eyes shadowed by exhausting paranoia. He does not look at her with the gentle relief of a worried husband. Instead, he watches her with the chilling focus of a predator who has just reclaimed a stolen artifact. The silence stretches out, thick and deeply suffocating. "You should not be here," she whispers. Her voice is completely shattered, devoid of any fighting anger. True tragedy does not always arrive with loud fury. It often lives in the quiet, hollow disbelief of someone realizing their deepest, darkest nightmare is never truly over. Dante's response remains unnervingly flat, masking a terrifying volatility beneath his measured words. Instinctively, Elena's trembling hand drops down to protect her stomach. The camera deliberately lingers on this gesture. It is a primal, maternal defense, anchoring her broken spirit to the innocent life growing inside her. Her throat visibly constricts. "How long?" she asks. 4 months, Dante replies with zero hesitation. Watch the absolute coldness of his pathology here. "You are certain," she murmurs, a flicker of reality piercing her exhaustion. "I do not deal in uncertainty," he states. This exposes the fatal flaw of his existence. He violently demands a perfectly calculated world, forgetting that the real substance of human life is only found in its messy, uncontrollable nature. Even the bitter end of their marriage was executed with clinical precision. There was no closure, just a cold severing of ties. To him, she was merely a variable removed from his stage. Her lips part, yielding a fragile accusation laced with the sorrow of a captive. She still aches for the monster who broke her. "Then, you should have known," she breathes. The camera catches a microscopic flinch in Dante's shoulders, revealing the agony required to hold his stoic mask in place. "I should have," he concedes. Those words carry an ocean of dark gravity. Elena exhales a shuddering breath. "I tried to tell you," she whispers. This teaches us a vital lesson. Silencing someone does not erase their truth. It only ensures that the ghost of their unspoken words will eventually return to destroy you. She catalogues her frantic attempts to reach him. "I called your office," she cries. "I went to the restaurant. I sent emails. I waited outside your building." She stops, painfully swallowing her degraded pride. "It does not matter." Dante's voice cracks like a whip. "It matters." Her eyes narrow, fighting the destructive emotional pull he still holds over her. "Does it?" "Because your decision was absolute." Dante steps closer, weaponizing his frame until the oxygen evaporates. "I gave orders," he growls, his tone dropping to a lethal hum. "Specific ones. You were supposed to be protected." A hollow laugh falls from her pale lips. It perfectly illustrates a dangerous tragedy. When we place our blind faith in having absolute authority, we leave ourselves entirely vulnerable to the brutal chaos of human betrayal. "Protected," she repeats, the word turning to ash on her tongue. "I have been surviving in a freezing room. I work double shifts simply to exist. I have not eaten a meal in days." Her fingers dig protectively into her stomach. "Stick with me here, because this is where the dynamic flips. We are witnessing the exact moment the godlike architecture of Dante's mind fractures. It is the terrifying realization that his rule was defied. "That is not what I ordered," he mutters. Elena stares back at him, a tragic detachment washing over her face. "Then, perhaps your commands hold far less power than you believe," she whispers. The silence between them is deafening. We ultimately learn that true power is never about the loud orders we shout, but the genuine loyalty of those meant to carry them out. Dante turns his back, his hand dragging heavily down his jawline. We are witnessing a narcissist viciously recalculating his broken reality, realizing a traitor poisoned his grand design. When he turns back, every trace of vulnerability has been erased, replaced by the cold clarity of a grim reaper. "Who stopped you?" he asks. His quiet voice drips with impending slaughter. Elena squints through her mental haze, her throat tightening. "A man from security. He had a scar on his cheek." She trembles. "He told me you would file a restraining order if I ever returned." The air in the room instantly drops below freezing. The hardest lesson of blind pride is discovering that the towering walls you built to keep your enemies out are the exact same ones trapping the deadly poison inside. Dante stands rigid, the pitch-black storm in his eyes triggering a primal panic within Elena. She begs, her voice shaking as her trauma bond finally shatters. "Did you tell him that?" Dante's denial is a swift execution. "No." One word. Instantly, the foundation of her nightmare crumbles. Her exhausted mind scrambles to survive the cognitive dissonance. "Then why?" She weeps. "Because someone wanted you entirely severed," Dante replies, his tone dropping to a sub-zero vibration. "Isolated and invisible." Her trembling hand flinches toward her stomach. "Why?" Dante's eyes track the movement, a lethal predator rising from the abyss. It reveals a chilling truth. The deepest wounds are rarely inflicted by our enemies, but by the treacherous hands hiding quietly within our own trusted walls. Because you are carrying something they cannot afford to let exist. The declaration hangs in the air like an inescapable death sentence. This is no longer a fractured romance. It is an unforgivable assault on a dangerous man's legacy. You and I are going to step directly into this aftermath together. The camera cuts to a decaying warehouse by the river, a rotting architectural corpse. Inside, the dark space is engineered for psychological terror. A single white light slashes across the cold concrete, casting jagged shadows where the silence feels unbearably heavy. The air is putrid, reeking of oil, rust, and the sharp tang of raw human panic. We see that when blind vengeance becomes a broken man's only religion, the dark temples he builds are always constructed from pure, unending agony. Let's step into this room together. You can almost feel the air turn to lead the second Dante walks through that door. The guards instantly Buffy, rigid to Cape's predator entering their territory. In the center of this concrete nightmare sits Tommaso, bound to a heavy metal chair. His head hangs heavy, dried blood crusting along his jaw. He is battered, drawing ragged breaths, but completely awake. This is not the reckless violence of a street thug. It is the surgical application of agony. The trauma was calculated to strip his defenses while denying him the escape of passing out. True cruelty rarely contents itself with bruising flesh. The most dangerous people meticulously dismantle your mind, ensuring you are awake for every inch of the fall. The frame pushes slowly on Marco, standing under harsh, flickering basement light. His sleeves are rolled past bruised knuckles, his face a perfect mask of detachment. He has been cooperative, Marco reports, though the words drop like dead weight. To a point, he quickly adds. Dante gives zero response. He simply glides forward, moving with the slow deliberation of a tiger, stopping only when he is inches from his captive. For an agonizing stretch of time, Dante weaponizes the quiet, letting the psychological weight crush his victim. Tamar so physically falls apart, his chest heaving as he is forced to stare into the dead void of Dante's eyes. It is a powerful lesson to remember. Sometimes, a total lack of sound is the heaviest weapon a person can ever wield against you. The light catches the exact second Tommaso shatters. Their eyes meet, and you can practically hear the snap of his mental strength echoing off the damp walls. Boss, his voice cracks, spilling over with panic. I can explain. Dante simply tilts his head, looking like a cold scientist examining a broken specimen. Explain what? Dante whispers, his tone carrying a soft, lethal edge. How my former wife ended up starving in a place where I do not even let my enemies walk, or how my unborn child was left without the guards I demanded. Tommaso swallows hard, his eyes darting frantically. That was not how it was supposed to happen, he stammers. Desperation is a cruel master. When basic survival is on the line, it quickly strips away every last ounce of our human dignity. The instructions were changed, Tommaso pleads, his shadow shaking against the wall. Dante's eyes narrow just a fraction. It is a tiny movement, but it fills the room with lethal gravity. It changed how? I was told to cut off all her connections. Tommaso begs, panic taking over. Total isolation. They told me she needed to disappear, that it was exactly what you wanted. A low vibration rumbles in Dante's chest, a dark laugh with no humor, and you bought that story. Tommaso freezes for a fatal second. Yes, he admits. You wanted her gone. Dante steps closer, turning the air into a tight vice. We so often surrender our minds to authority figures, yet unquestioning obedience, without verifying the truth, always becomes the ultimate betrayal of those we meant to serve. I do not pay you to make assumptions, Dante whispers, his voice cutting the air like a razor. I pay you to follow my orders exactly. Tommaso gasps for breath. I did. No, Dante cuts in, terrifyingly smooth. You listen to someone else. The heavy silence drops over the basement again. Look closely at this moment with me. Underneath the terror, Tommaso is trying to hide something, and Dante sees right through it. The lie makes his face turn dead. Who gave the order? He asks softly. Tommaso shakes his head. Nobody. I just figured. You figured wrong. Dante grabs the man by his jaw, fingers digging into flesh. Life has a harsh way of punishing lazy choices, blindly trusting a broken chain of command without asking hard questions guarantees your own tragic downfall. We need to look at the sick nature of power happening here. Dante speaks in a low murmur, but every word carries the crushing weight of a man who plays God. You let her starve, he says. He is talking about Alina and the unborn child, treating them as extensions of his own ego. Tommaso fights against the restraints, crying openly, swearing the orders came from higher up the ladder. But in Dante's world, excuses do not exist. Making a mistake is the exact same thing as treason. Tommaso breaks down entirely, a trapped animal realizing the wolf will not listen to reason. It is a brutal reminder for all of us. When you hand over your personal morals to please someone in charge, you alone pay the final bill. Dante squeezes the man's jaw harder, taking absolute control. Higher than me? Dante asks. Notice how the flickering bulb catches a flash of real curiosity in his stare. For a man who practically rules the city, the idea of someone above him is nothing but a sick joke. Tommaso freezes. In that one terrible second of quiet, Dante pulls the truth out of him. When the tied-up man finally crumbles, he admits the money came from the Russo family. That name floats in the cold basement, like a poisonous cloud. Marco immediately stiffens, his fingers instinctively brushing the gun at his waist. But Dante does not move a single muscle. He stands there like a statue. The real world works exactly like this. The people who can truly destroy you never scream or throw tantrums. They just go completely still, quietly planning the exact angle of the fatal blow. For Dante, hearing the Russo name is not about stolen territory. It is a deeply personal, unforgivable insult. His brain instantly connects the dots. The fake orders, cutting off her bank accounts, destroying her phone lines. It was a brilliant psychological attack. They wanted to trap Alina in a corner, tearing down her defenses until she was entirely helpless. We forget this hard truth about our own battles. Devastating moves are never loud or flashy. True power is found in the quiet, systematic removal of an opponent's foundation. See, Dante suddenly understands they were trying to drag his one blind spot into the daylight. They did not just want her gone, he mutters. His voice is ice, speaking only to the violent machine inside his own head. Marco gives a heavy nod, putting the brutal puzzle together. A woman left alone is the perfect target in their vicious circle. Dante's thoughts snap to his unborn child, an extension of his massive ego, a legacy someone dared to threaten before it was even born. Chained to the chair, Tommaso shakes uncontrollably, begging for a second chance. He swears he never meant for things to go this far, thinking it was just a job to keep her hidden. Dante stares down at him, and every drop of human feeling drains from his face. There is no anger left, just the blank stare of an executioner. You did not need to know, Dante whispers. It is a heavy truth we all have to swallow. Simply claiming ignorance of the damage you are causing will never, ever wash the blood off your hands. Tommaso goes entirely still. You can see the final spark of hope die in his eyes, replaced by the crushing certainty that he will not survive tonight. The room feels 10 degrees colder. Dante turns his back. Mentally, he has already buried the man. His brain is consumed by the sheer disrespect of someone touching his property. Marco steps up, asking for final orders. Dante does not even break his stride. Make sure the streets know, he commands, his voice completely flat. Tell them this is what happens when you touch my blood. He pushes the heavy steel door open, letting the freezing wind rip into the room. We should all remember this fact. The absolute worst cruelty does not come from screaming, fiery rage. It is almost always born from a cold, unbending ego. And Marco, Dante says over his shoulder, letting the silence hang for a second. We are not done here. What began as a mistake has turned into a scorched earth war. Now, stick with me here as the scene changes to match his fracturing mind. The hospital is not a place of healing anymore. It is a lockdown fortress, guarded by armed men in cheap suits. Dante stands perfectly stiff outside the glass wall of the intensive care room. On the other side, Alina is hooked up to flashing screens, trapped in a web of plastic tubes. She looks incredibly small, robbed of her fierce independence. It is one of the saddest facts of life. We take the roaring presence of the people we love for granted, only realizing how much we needed them when they're reduced to a fading, fragile ghost. I want you to look closely at Dante's face right here. That stubborn fire Alina always carried is gone. Her skin is the color of chalk, floating halfway between living and dying. For the first time, we see a real crack in Dante's titanium shell. An actual human feeling is bubbling up, threatening his perfect composure. But a man like this does not know how to be sad. His brain cannot process grief, so it instantly twists that pain into a violent need for revenge. The slow beep of the heart monitor is the only thing keeping him grounded. She is fighting for air, and inside her, that unborn child is fighting too. The truth hidden in this tragedy is profound. No matter how hopelessly dark a situation gets, the stubborn human drive to stay alive is a genuine miracle. Just watch the subtle tightening of Dante's jaw. His mind is tearing him apart right now, playing back every choice like a slow-motion film. He pushed Alina away with cold precision, fully believing that breaking her heart would save her life. It is a quiet tragedy among those holding power, thinking that simply walking away creates a shield emerged, instead leaving her behind only carved out the perfect empty space for his rivals to strike. Marco steps up, his heavy shoes silenced by the hum of the hospital machines. Security is doubled, Marco says, though his voice shakes with a fear he rarely shows. Every door and hallway is now watched. It brings us to a hard truth about human nature. The control we throw away to protect someone is the exact thing we will bleed to get back once they are hurt. No one enters without being cleared 3 times, Marco promises. The words hang in the freezing air of the ward, sounding incredibly hollow. Dante refuses to look away from the glass, watching the broken shape of the woman he loves. They already got close once, Dante answers. His voice is empty of anger, yet carries the crushing weight of a man who knows the game too well. That means they had help. Marco does not even try to argue. The crime family hunting them did not break down the front door with guns. They found a tiny fracture in the foundation and slipped their poison right through it. It forces us to confront a reality we all learn eventually. The knives that leave the deepest scars are never swung by strangers in an alleyway. They are held by the people we invite.
Yet.
Marco speaks the ugly truth out loud, warning that the people who want Alina gone will absolutely try again. Dante barely shifts his weight, moving like a wolf catching a scent on the wind. No, Dante corrects him, his voice barely a whisper. They will expect her to die here. When a crisis hits, assuming you know the enemy's next move only creates fatal blind spots. Through the heavy glass, A's nurse steps into the dim room. She adjusts the medical tubes with what looks like total confidence. But Dante catches the tiny, frantic shaking in her wrist. He sees her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. We can take away a very real lesson from this tension. No matter how deeply we try to bury our worst intentions, guilt will always leak out and show itself through the body. That tiny slip in her mask lasts for less than a second, but it gives Dante all the proof he needs. Who is she? He asks, never taking his eyes off the woman behind the window. Marco follows his cold stare. She is on the new rotation. Marco mutters softly, cleared through the hospital bosses. Dante does not blink, but the space between the men suddenly feels dangerous. Bring me her file, he commands. Marco disappears down the bright hallway, gesturing silently to guards who would gladly die for this family. Inside that glass box, the fake nurse finishes her work. Dante remains perfectly still, observing her every breath. It brings up a profound rule of survival. The biggest red flags we encounter are almost never waved in our faces. They wait patiently in the small details we walk past every day. Today, you and I will look closely at this exact moment together. Watch how the false nurse moves. Her shaking fingers hover over the medicine tubes for a heartbeat too long. Notice how she completely avoids looking at the helpless woman breathing softly beside her. Her posture leans toward the exit, her body screaming a desperate need to run. In Dante's dark world, these tiny cracks are a signed confession. The silence stretches out until Marco rushes back. There is no record at all, Marco whispers. She does not exist in the system. Dante slowly turns his head, and the sadness of a broken husband is instantly gone. It reminds us of a chilling fact. True danger never announces itself with loud anger. It walks right up to your front door, wearing a mask of absolute, empty calm. Then she should not be in my hospital, Dante replies. The judgment carries zero mercy. Inside the room, the imposter wraps her hand around the door handle, ready to vanish. Time seems to stretch, pulling the coming violence into one painfully long breath. Stop her, Dante commands softly. Notice how he never yells. A person who truly holds power never has to raise their voice. Marco moves before the sentence finishes. The hospital door flies open as 2 guards step out of the shadows. blocking her path with terrifying speed. The nurse freezes instantly. Her professional mask shatters, revealing nothing but pure animal panic. It proves a simple rule of life. We can spend years building elaborate disguises to hide our bad intentions, but reality will always rip them away when we least expect it. Break this moment down for a second. The deep fear in the assassin's eyes is not about going to prison. It is the raw terror of failing the ruthless people who hired her. She glances at the sleeping patient, then down at the deadly medicine tube. "Do not touch anything," Dante warns, stepping into the room. It is fascinating how a deeply focused person shifts the gravity of a space just by entering it. Suddenly, the steady beeping of the heart monitor feels incredibly loud. This was meant to be a quiet execution. The cornered woman tries to speak, but the words dry up the second Dante locks eyes with her. "Who sent you?" he asks plainly. This offers a brilliant lesson about authority. True strength never needs to throw aggressive threats. It simply stands its ground with quiet, unbreakable certainty. She gives him nothing but stubborn silence. Yet the physical body always betrays our secrets. For a split second, a spark of recognition flashes in her eyes. She is not thinking of Dante, but of the shadowy figures who designed this trap. Right then, the awful truth snaps into place. This is not some random hit against his wife. The betrayal goes right down to the bedrock of his family. Instead of lashing out, a freezing wave of logic washes over his face. He realizes his untouchable empire has rotted from the inside. Now every doctor walking past the door is a suspect. It serves as a heavy reminder of how delicate trust truly is. The massive walls we build to keep danger away are completely useless if we have already invited the monsters to sit at our own dinner table. He steps further into the room without a single ounce of doubt. The armed men instantly shift into formation, moving with the dark, fluid grace of wolves supporting their leader. On the narrow bed, Alina rests quietly. Her chest rises and falls with delicate breaths, completely blind to how close she just came to the end of her life. The cornered assassin opens her mouth, trying to spin a story, but the heavy pressure of Dante's eyes crushes her ability to lie. She is nothing more than a human weapon, smuggled past the gates by traitors who planned every second of this. It brings up a harsh reality we often ignore in our own routines. The things that cause us the most harm do not look like weapons at all. They usually come dressed up in fake empathy and a beautifully rehearsed smile. Marco's face turns to stone, matching the freezing anger rolling off his boss. Without needing an order, he locks down the entire hospital wing, cutting off communication to the streets outside. There are no blazing alarms, just a heavy drop in the room's temperature. Stick with me here, because this is where the mind of a desperate man shows its true colors. Dante traces the plastic IV tube with his eyes, figuring out exactly how this killer planned to stop Alina's heart. He sees the poison is still trapped in the plastic, inches from her veins. He analyzes the attempt like a computer, entirely empty of mercy. It points to a stark truth about trauma. When we are shoved over the absolute edge of grief, our minds stop feeling the burn of sadness and simply start calculating how to survive the night. The details do not matter to him anymore. Rival studied his habits, found his weak spot, and timed this betrayal perfectly. They expected Alina to fade away in the quiet of the night, but they deeply misjudged the terrifying scale of Dante's loyalty. "Clear the medicine line," he orders softly. The command carries a guaranteed promise of violence. One bodyguard steps away to bring in a trusted doctor. Focus on the trapped assassin now. Her chest heaves with ragged breaths. Dante simply observes her, disconnected from her panic, as her tough exterior melts into raw terror. True loyalty is a remarkably rare thing. When you finally find someone genuinely worth protecting, you must defend them with everything you have against a world that constantly tries to tear people apart. You and I can see through this moment. The shaking taking over her body has nothing to do with the pain Dante might cause. It is the dread of disappointing the bosses pulling her strings. "Who gave you access?" Dante asks again. His tone is totally dead, stripped of human warmth. He is building a cage around her, locking down every mental exit. Her refusal to speak is not bravery. It is a desperate math problem, weighing the price of snitching against the monster standing 2 feet away. Marco steps back into the light, holding a screen full of stolen hospital data. A tough lesson about life sits right in the middle of this standoff. The heaviest chains we drag through our years are usually the invisible favors we foolishly accept from the worst possible people. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The glow of the security monitor paints a chilling truth across Dante's face. 3 nameless figures, moving like phantoms, slipping through restricted doors, using forged credentials over the last 2 hours. This is no random strike. Dante recognizes the terrifying symmetry of a synchronized purge. The enemy is systematically erasing every breathing soul tied to his empire. This sanctuary of healing has been quietly inverted into an abattoir. When he demands the whereabouts of the legitimate medical staff, the answer is already sitting like ash in his mouth. They are completely gone, wiped from the cameras, vanished into thin air. It serves as a haunting reminder for all of us. The places we trust to keep us safest often become our graves the very second we allow our vigilance to sleep. The lens lingers on the sharp, unforgiving angles of Dante's profile, half buried in the shadows. He studies the captive with an unblinking intensity. Her silence is not born of fear, but of a cold, calculated emptiness. This unseen enemy understands the exact architecture of Dante's paranoia, mapping every dark corner of his mind. It brings up a painful reality we all face. The most fatal wounds we endure are almost always delivered by hands we once held in trust. Under the buzzing fluorescent lights, a battered physician trembles, flushing the intravenous line to drag Alina back from the brink. Dante stands utterly motionless, carved from stone. Yet beneath that terrifying stillness, his mind is a frantic machine, obsessively cataloging every single drop of fluid to maintain his illusion of absolute control. You and I need to look closely at what happens in this exact moment. The fragile chirp of Alina's heart meter cuts through the heavy air. Her deep trauma bond forces her broken body to simply refuse the release of death. From the corner, the captive operative speaks, whispering that he is already far too late. Notice Dante's reaction. A lesser man would lash out, but he simply lets the poison hang in the freezing room. The ultimate tragedy of absolute power is how thoroughly it isolates you, leaving you alone when the truth finally corners you. His face remains a mask of ice as he leans in, softly whispering, "Not yet." But the heavy silence shatters when Marco involuntarily flinches, the raw, instinctual twitch of a man realizing the fatal flames are already burning inside their own walls. Marco's eyes dart toward the doorway, his mind violently struggling to process the sudden collapse of their fortress. Dante does not need a briefing. He feels the distinct shift in the room's atmospheric pressure, the suffocating stillness that crashes down when authority is stripped away. It teaches us a brutal lesson. Permanent safety is merely a comforting bedtime story we tell ourselves to endure the dark. Dante feels the floor drop away, seconds before Marco's radio erupts in frantic static. Out in the hallway, the shadows of his men twist from calm defense into blind, chaotic panic. The grand illusion of invincibility is dead. The captive's dry warning echoes like a cruel verdict handed down by an unforgiving god, exposing the deep, bleeding fractures in Dante's heavy iron armor. For the first time, a freezing crack forms in Dante's mind eye. The walls have completely failed. He is no longer holding back a tragedy. He is simply drowning in its wake. Marco steps closer, his voice tight and breathless with raw fear. He reveals that a guard was just found dead in the lower tunnels, the body cold for an hour. Dante's face remains locked in pale marble, but the brutal timeline is ripping him apart. If blood was spilled an hour ago, this phantom walked right past his entire standing army. It is a mistake we all make. We focus with such obsession on the enemies standing directly in front of us that we leave our backs completely bare to the knife. It is a terrifying piece of deception, playing out perfectly while the arrogant master of control was busy watching the wrong stage. The lens follows the heavy weight of Dante's gaze. He realizes this is no simple breach. It is a parasite, buried so deeply in the hospital's veins that it slipped past his watch. He looks down at Alina, the blue light of the monitor tracing her fragile face. Then, in a heartbreaking shift, he shuts off his own capacity for mercy. The threat below requires the dormant monster inside him to wake up. We must always remember a harsh truth. Absolute power is never a fortress. It is merely a fragile glass house waiting for a heavier stone. He orders the floor sealed, his voice dropping to a chilling, flat note of authority. Any shadow will be met with gunfire. Marco swallows hard, nodding as the grim reality of a total lockdown settles over the suffocating, silent room. Stick with me, because the entire mood is about to break. Notice the armed men surrounding him. Their knuckles are white as they grip the steel, their bodies sweating before their minds even understand why. It is pure prey instinct. Dante walks away from Alina's bedside, physically severing the invisible thread between them. In his tragically warped mind, her ragged breathing is no longer a miracle of life. It is merely another trophy of his dominance. As they descend into the dark beneath the hospital, the air grows thick and metallic. The clean white walls die away, traded for a damp, rusting maze of iron. A single bulb overhead flickers in a slow, jarring rhythm. An ordinary man would ignore it. But Dante watches the shadows dance, clenching his jaw. He knows exactly what this means. The unseen hunter is purposely blinding them. Every shadow in this basement is designed to break the mind. The killer placed the fallen guard exactly where Dante's men would trip over him. The heavy steel door was pried open with terrifying, surgical grace. The dead boy's uniform is completely spotless, painting a haunting picture of silent, brutal efficiency. It teaches us a deeply painful truth. The most destructive forces in our lives almost never announce their arrival. Dante crouches beside the pale corpse, his dark coat sweeping the wet concrete. He does not pause to mourn the lost soldier. Instead, he simply studies the twisted neck, reading the violent poetry left behind. He is carefully mapping the soul of an enemy who wants to completely crush Dante's ruling spirit long before ever stepping out of the freezing dark. The damp hall splits into the dark, tangled veins of the building, exposing thick pipes and the heavy hum of generators. The camera pans slowly. Dante's voice drops to a gravelly whisper. He realizes they did not come here just to shoot Alina. Marco's face drains of color as the trap snaps shut. They are here to force the king into a brutal choice. High above, Alina lies helpless, tied to the life-saving machines. Down here, The entire power grid lies completely bare. It highlights the tragic irony of building a fortress. The higher your walls, the harder you fall when the foundation is slashed. The enemy isn't aiming for Dante's flesh. They are aiming straight for his rotting soul, using his own obsessive love as the very weapon that will ultimately burn his massive empire to the ground. Somewhere in the shadows stands a phantom director, forcing Dante into a brutal Greek tragedy. It is a sadistic test of a king's ego. A faint metallic click echoes through the corridor. Slipping under the heavy roar of the machinery, the lens Titan turns on Dante. He does not twitch, but his mind isolates the noise instantly. It isn't a footstep. It is the rhythmic, unforgiving tick of a timer. We always operate under the delusion that time is our friend until we hear it bleeding out. His jaw locks, a stone gargoyle holding back a storm, but the air turns toxic. The hunt is over. The execution has started. He barks a single, vicious command. His soldiers scatter into the dark, their lights cutting wild, panicked beams through a rusty maze designed explicitly to blind and bury them alive. Dante stalks toward the ticking sound, his heart beating with a terrifying, dead calm. His dark eyes scan the red fire pipes and massive oxygen tanks. Any piece of this room could be a weapon. The sharp clicking pulls them to a sealed electrical box. Marco rips the steel door off its hinges, and for one agonizing second, the men completely forget how to breathe. It isn't dynamite. It is a waking nightmare for a man obsessed with absolute control. A small black device is wired directly into the hospital's pulsing iron heart. The glowing screen spits thousands of lines of frantic code, wrapping like a digital snake around the life support grid. This isn't a fire waiting to explode. It is a creeping, silent venom designed to make the entire concrete building slowly choke to death. You and I must pause right here, at the edge of his ruin. Dante leans in, the green light reflecting in his hollow eyes. He reads the code and understands the horror. This parasite won't kill everyone at once. It will cut the power bed by bed, starting with Alina. The cruelties is absolute. The unseen ghost is waiting to see if the king will burn his own city to save his fragile queen. The truth doesn't make Dante scream. A suffocating grief simply crushes his chest. It reminds us that true punishment is never physical. It is watching your own arrogant sins destroy the one pure thing you tried to protect. The goal was never just a body count. It was to strip the great man completely bare, leaving his broken, weeping soul exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light. Dante built his empire on the dangerous delusion that he could play God without ever paying the devil. Down in the dark, a small server hums against cold iron worse than any bomb. Cascading code exposes a ghost, a killer treating the hospital like a choking victim. They refuse to grant Dante a quick end. They want him to suffocate on his own despair, timing his absolute ruin to Alina's fading pulse in the room above. Marco attempts to report the breach, but pure terror bleeds into the loyal soldier's words. The camera pushes tight on his trembling jaw, showing that the untouchable king is falling. It is a sobering lesson we must all learn eventually. The higher we build our walls of pride and control, the more devastating the impact when reality finally breaks them down. Let us step into this basement together, you and I, and feel the crushing weight of this second. The fluorescent glare washes out Dante's features, painting him as a ghost in his own kingdom. Marco stands nearby, his voice cracking over a system failure with zero backups. Dante does not speak. His unblinking eyes lock onto the crawling code, dissecting the mind of the phantom who wrote it. Beneath his thick armor of detachment, a deeply human panic bleeds through. This is not a street war. It is a surgical violation of his spirit. The profound truth of life is that our deepest wounds rarely come from random strangers. They almost always come from the very few who know exactly where our emotional armor is the weakest, leaving us completely exposed. The camera lingers on the unnatural stillness of Dante's shoulders. This digital ambush is a masterpiece of psychological warfare, weaponizing his guarded secrets. The forged identities, Alina's sudden isolation, and the unborn child Dante never even knew existed until today. The odds of this being random are absolutely zero. Marco whispers that the enemy wants Dante paralyzed, hoping to force a fatal mistake. Dante's jaw tightens, proving his soldier right. Yet, the expected explosion of human panic never comes. Instead, Dante sinks into a chilling, sociopathic calm. They want a reaction, he states with ice in his throat. In our own lives, blind emotional reactions only make us predictable targets for others. Finding the strength to pause is what keeps us safe and truly free. Watch as he moves, extending a steady hand toward the humming servers. He does not rip the hardware from the wall. Instead, he gently traces the wires, mapping the exact boundaries of the digital parasite. This trap was designed to force tunnel vision, pushing a desperate man to make a reckless choice out of blinding fear. But every manipulation carries a flaw. Suddenly, Dante shatters the quiet, barking a harsh order for his men to sever all external access. Marco freezes, completely baffled. A total shutdown means surrendering the syndicate's entire network, yet Dante chooses to isolate the venom over saving his empire. The lesson here is profound and deeply human. Sometimes, to protect what we love most, we must be willing to cut the cord and bravely stand alone. By forging a closed loop, the predator hiding in the shadows is instantly rendered blind. Realization sparks in Marco's widening eyes as the brilliance of the maneuver washes over him. Commands echo with ruthless efficiency, racing ahead of the lethal virus. Dante's men move like white blood cells, cleanly severing digital arteries and quarantining the infection in real time. The basement holds its breath while the network is rewired. The parasite keeps thrashing, unaware it is now screaming into an empty void. High above them, Alina's heart monitor flutters, then settles into a steady rhythm. True strength is rarely loud and boastful. Real power is found in the quiet, unyielding resilience that simply endures long after the hardest storms of our lives have finally passed. Her fragile biology is finally torn away from the sadistic digital grip that nearly took her life. Down below, Dante feels the dramatic shift. It is not an emotional release, but a visceral, heavy drop in the room's air pressure. For the first time since this nightmare began, the stress hormones flooding his veins begin to ebb. Yet, this is not true relief. It is only the brief, hollow delay of grief. Marco whispers that the external threat can finally be deleted. Dante gives a single, heavy nod. The keystrokes fall, and the menacing algorithm collapses into harmless dead data. The silence that fills this is different now. It is the cold, clinical stillness of a morgue. It reminds us of a hard truth. Surviving a deep tragedy never means walking away completely unscarred. Let us pause right here, you and I, because this tight cinematic frame holds a devastating lesson. Those who obsessively seek to control everything around them are always the easiest to manipulate. Dante does not relax. His paranoid mind is still turning, dissecting the ruined code to find the unseen architect's real motive. With a slow, mechanical dread, he pulls his encrypted phone from his dark coat. He does not speak a word into it. There is no need, because the psychological bomb has already been planted. Glowing on the cracked screen is a single sentence without a sender. The words hit like a physical blow, a masterstroke of cruelty. She was never the true target. The illusion of absolute control is the most dangerous lie we ever tell ourselves. Watch closely as the ironclad psyche of a criminal kingpin visibly shatters on screen. The genius of his enemy's manipulation becomes agonizingly clear in this quiet moment. The hospital lockdown, Alina's failing heart, the revelation of the pregnancy. They were nothing but a grand diversion designed by a masterful psychopath. Dante's face remains a perfectly blank canvas, but underneath, every wire in his mind is violently snapping. He realizes he committed the ultimate sin. He left his deepest vulnerability unprotected while guarding his pride. It is a brutal truth we must all face. We spend so much precious energy building walls around the things we already possess, that we leave our vital futures entirely unguarded and waiting for the wolves. This elaborate chess game was built for one singular purpose. The unseen enemy wanted to violently amputate Dante from his own future. I have spent years observing the dark hearts of men on screen, and this is the classic predator's strike. They do not just draw blood, they burn your potential to ash. Dante suddenly spins with kinetic fury, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp command to get him back upstairs immediately. But his dark eyes betray the terrifying truth. His mind is no longer in the medical ward. He knows that far beyond these fortified walls, his true heart sits entirely exposed. It is a sobering reminder for every single one of us. No matter how obsessively we try to lock the world away, we can never shield everything we love from the chaos of life.